Hey, hello everybody. So this is as best as I can make for a makeup stream because I had to do such a brief one on Monday. But I believe the last time I did a little history of the world, it was reasonably popular. So I thought it'd be a good kind of a good makeup would be to do a little bit more of this. So I have the book with me. I actually probably should get myself a little bit of water, so maybe I'll give you some more ensnare to listen to. Um, but I'm not quite sure how many chapters we'll go in. We got up to chapter 8 last time. It went for about an hour and a half. I don't have an early class tomorrow, so I should be okay to do a little bit more of a substantial reading, but we'll see how it goes. So, tell you what, guys, I am actually gonna get myself set up with some water so you can enjoy a little bit more ensnare, and we'll start straight after that. Okay, talk to you in a bit. All right. Sorry about the delay. Let's start the book. Well, once I find my chapter. And of course, we will have some background music for this. I just need to set that up too. Chapter 9. Two small cities on one small land. I said earlier that Greece, when set against the Persian Empire, was no more than a small peninsula, dotted here and there with little cities of busy merchants, a country of barren mountain ranges and stony fields, able to sustain only a handful of people. And also you may remember that the Greeks belonged to a number of tribes, the most important of them being the Dorians in the south and the Ionians and the Aeolians in the north. These tribes differed little from one another, either in appearance or language. They spoke different dialects, which they could all understand if they chose, but they very rarely did, for as is often the case, the close-related neighboring tribes were unable to get along with each other. They spent all their time exchanging insults and ridicule, when actually they were jealous of each other. For Greece had no one king or administration in common. Instead, each city was a kingdom in itself. But one thing united the Greeks: their religion and their sport. And I say one thing because, strangely enough, sport and religion weren't two separate things. They were closely connected. For instance, in honor of Zeus, the father of the gods, great sporting contests were held every 4 years in his sanctuary at Olympia. As well as the large temples, there was a stadium at Olympia, and all the Greeks, the Dorians, the Ionians, Spartans, and Athenians, came there to show how well that they could run, throw the discus and the javelin, fight hand-to-hand, and race chariots. To be victorious at Olympia was the greatest honor in a man's life. The prize was no more than a simple garland made of sprigs of wild olive, but what fame for the winners! The greatest poets sang their praises, the greatest sculptors carved their statues to stand forever in Olympia. They were shown in their chariots, throwing the discus or rubbing oil onto their bodies before the fight. Victory statues like these can still be seen today. There may even be one in your local museum. Since the Olympic Games took place every 4 years and were attended by all the Greeks, they provided everyone with a convenient way to measure time. This was gradually adopted throughout Greece. Just as we say BC, meaning before the birth of Christ, or AD, after the birth of Christ, Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord in Latin, the Greeks would say at the time of this or that Olympiad. The first Olympiad was in 776 BC. Can you work out when the 10th would have been? But don't forget, they only happened every 4 years. But it wasn't only the Olympic Games that brought all the Greeks together. There was another sanctuary which they held sacred. This one was at Delphi and belonged to the sun god Apollo, and there was something most peculiar about it. As sometimes happens in volcanic regions, there was a fissure in the ground from which vapor issued. If anyone inhaled it, it literally clouded their mind. It was the same as if they were drunk or delirious, and nothing they said made any sense. The very meaninglessness of these utterances seemed deeply mysterious to the Greeks, who said that the god himself speaks through a mortal mouth. So they had a priestess, whom they called Pythia, sit over the fissure on a 3-legged stool, while other priests interpreted her babble as predictions for the future. The shrine was known as the Delphic Oracle, and at different moments in their lives, Greeks from everywhere made pilgrimage to Delphi to consult the god Apollo. The answer they received was often far from clear, and could be understood in a variety of ways. And in fact, we still say that vague or enigmatic answer is oracular. Let us now take a closer look at two of Greece's most important cities, Sparta and Athens. We already know something about the Spartans. They were Dorians, who, when they arrived in Greece in about 1100 BC, enslaved the former inhabitants and put them to work on their land. But the slaves outnumbered their masters, and the danger of rebellion meant that the Spartans had to be constantly on alert, lest they find themselves homeless again. They only had one aim in life, to be fighting fit, ready to crush any uprising by their slaves, and to protect themselves from the surrounding peoples still at liberty. And they really did think of nothing else. Their lawgiver, Lycurgus, had already seen to that. A Spartan baby that appeared weak and unlikely to grow up to be a warrior was killed at birth. A strong infant had to be made stronger. From a very young age, he must train from dawn till dusk, learn to endure pain, hunger, and cold, must eat poorly and be denied all pleasure. Boys were beaten just to harden them to pain. A harsh upbringing is still called Spartan today, and as you know, it worked. At Thermopylae in 480 BC, in obedience to their law, the Spartans allowed themselves to be massacred by the Persians. Knowing how to die like that isn't easy, but knowing how to live is, perhaps, even harder. And this is what the Athenians aimed to do. They weren't looking for an easy, comfortable life, but one that had meaning. A life of which something remained after one's death. Something of benefit to those who came after. You'll just see how they succeeded. Had they not lived in fear of their own slaves, the Spartans might never have become so warlike and brave. Athenians had fewer reasons to be afraid, and they didn't live under the same pressures. Things were different from them, though, as in Sparta, the nobles who once ruled Athens imposed harsh laws drawn up from an Athenian named Draco. These laws were so strict that people still speak of draconian severity. But the people of Athens, who had roamed the seas in their ships and had heard and seen so many different things, did not consent to this for long. It was in fact a nobleman who had the wisdom to try to give the little state a new system of government. His name was Solon, and the laws he introduced in 594 BC, at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, were named after him. They stated that the people, that is the city's inhabitants, should decide the city's affairs themselves. They should assemble in the marketplace of Athens and vote. The majority should decide and should elect a council of experts to put those decisions into effect. This sort of government is called democracy, or the rule of the people in Greek. This didn't mean that anyone who lived in Athens was entitled to vote in the assembly. Citizenship depended on wealth and influence, and many people, including women and slaves, played no part in the government. But many Athenians could still at least have their say, and so they took an interest in how the city was run. Polis is Greek for city, politics, the affairs of the cities. For a while, individual noblemen curried favor with people to win their votes, and then seize power. Rulers like these were called tyrants, but the people soon expelled them and took better care next time to ensure that it was they themselves who really governed. I've already told you about the wayward nature of the Athenians, And it was this, together with a real fear of losing their freedom once again, which led them to banish any politician who showed signs of becoming too popular, lest he seize power for himself and rule as a tyrant. These same free people of Athens who defeated the Persians and later treated Miltiades and Themistocles with such ingratitude. There was one politician who avoided this fate. His name was Pericles. When he spoke in the assembly, the Athenians always believed that it was they who made the decisions, whereas in fact it was Pericles who had made up his mind long before. This wasn't because he held any special office or had any particular power. He was simply the wisest and the most intelligent. And so he gradually worked up his way until, by 444 BC, a number as beautiful as the time that it represents, he was in effect the city's sole ruler. His chief concern was that Athens should maintain its power at sea, and this he achieved through alliances with other Ionian cities who paid Athens for its protection. In this way, the Athenians grew rich and could at last afford to make use of their great gifts. And now I hear you asking, but what exactly did they do that was so great? And I can only say, everything. But two things interested them most, and these were truth and beauty. Their assemblies had taught that the Athenians how to discuss all matters openly, with arguments for and against. This was good training in learning how to think. Soon they were using arguments and counter-arguments, not just when they were debating everyday matters like whether or not to increase taxation, but discussions about the whole of nature. The Ionians and the colonial outposts must have been ahead of them there, for they had already reflected on the world, on what the world was actually made of, and what might be the cause of all events and experiences. This sort of reflection is what we call philosophy. In Athens, however, the reflecting or philosophizing went much further. They also wanted to know how people should act, what was good and what was evil, and what was just and what was unjust. They wanted to find explanations for human experience and discover the essence of all things. Of course, not everyone agreed on matters as complex as these, for there were various theories and opinions, and they were argued back and forth, just as in the People's Assembly. And since that time, the sort of reflection and reasoned argument that we call philosophy has never stopped. So I'm just going to take a second to turn off the notifications. By the way, hello everybody. I am doing, because I've broken the narrative, we're doing a story-only stream tonight. If you are not familiar with this book, there is a VOD in my highlights of A Little History of the World by Ernst Gombrich. And this is just a continuation of that book. So if I'm a little unresponsive to chat, it's just because I don't want to break up the narrative like I'm doing right now. But the Athenians didn't only pace up and down on their porticos and sports fields talking about things like the essence of life and how to recognize it and where it all came from. They didn't just picture the world in a new way in their minds, they saw it with new eyes. When you look at the works of Greek artists and see how fresh and simple and beautiful they are, it is as if their creators were seeing the world for the very first time. We spoke of statues of Olympic champions earlier. They show fine human beings, not posed, but looking as if the position that they are shown in is the most natural one in the world, and it is because they seem so natural that they are so beautiful. The Greeks portrayed their gods with the same beauty and humanity. The most famous sculptor of these statues was Phidias. He did not create mysterious and supernatural images like the colossal statues in the Egyptian temples. Although some of his temple statues were large and splendid and made of the most precious materials like ivory and gold, their beauty was never insipid, and they had a noble and natural grace which must have inspired confidence in the gods that they represented. And the same can be said for Athenian paintings and buildings. But nothing remains of the pictures that they painted on the walls or their halls and assembly rooms. All we have are little paintings on pottery, on vases and urns. Their loveliness tells us about what we have lost. However, the temples are still standing, even in Athens, and best of all, the citadel of Athens is still there, the Acropolis, where the new sanctuaries made of marble were erected in the time of Pericles, because the old ones had been burnt and destroyed by the Persians while the Athenians watched from the island of Salamis. The Acropolis still contains the most beautiful buildings we know, not the grandest or the most splendid, simply the most beautiful. Every detail is so clear and so simple that one cannot imagine it otherwise. All the forms which the Greeks employed in their buildings were to be used again and again in architecture. You'll find Greek columns, of which there are several kinds, in almost every city in the world, once you've learned to recognize them. But none of them is as beautiful as those in the Acropolis, where they're used not for show or decoration, but for purpose, for which they were invented, the elegant supports of the roof. Both wisdom and the thought of beauty of form were to be united in the Athenians by a third art, the art of poetry. And here too they invented something new, the theater. Their theater, like sport, was also bound up with their religion, with festivals held in honor of the god Dionysus, also known as Bacchus. On his feast day, a performance was held which could last all day. It took place in the open air, and the actors wore huge masks and high heels so that they could be seen from a distance and heard. We still have the plays which they performed. Some are serious, grand, and solemn. These are called tragedies. But there are other ones which are very sharp, witty, and lively, which made fun of certain Athenian citizens. These were called comedies. I could tell you a lot more about the Athenians, about their historians and their doctors, their singers, their thinkers, and their artists. But I think it would be better for you to find out about them yourself one day. Then you'll see that I haven't exaggerated. Chapter 10. The Enlightened One and His Land. And now let us go to the opposite end of the world, to India and then to China, so that we can find out what was going on in these vast lands at the time of the Persian Wars. Like Mesopotamia, India also has a very ancient civilization, and about the same time as the Sumerians were holding sway at Ur, that is, around 2500 BC, there was a mighty city in the valley of the Indus. The Indus is a great river which flows through what is Pakistan today. It had well-drained streets, canals, granaries, and workshops, and was called the Mohenjo-Daro, and until its discovery in the 1920s, nobody had ever dreamt of its existence. When it was excavated, things came to light that were remarkable as any found in the rubble mounds at Ur. Although we know almost nothing about the people who built the Mohenjo-Daro, we do know that different people arrived much later, and that they were the ancestors of the people who inhabit northern India and Pakistan today. These people spoke a language similar not only to those spoken by the Persians and the Greeks, but also those of the Romans and the Teutons. An example of this is the word for father. In ancient Indian, it was pitar. The Greek is pater, and the Latin, pater. Since both Indians and Europeans speak these languages, they are known as the Indo-European family of languages. Whether the fact the languages are similar means that the people who speak them are actually distant relatives, we don't know yet for sure. But in any event, the people who spoke an Indo-European language invaded India much as the Dorians invaded Greece, and they must have enslaved a native population just as they did. In time, most of the continent was subdued by the descendants of these invaders, who, like the Spartans, maintained a distance between themselves and the people they had conquered. Traces of this division persist today in what is known as the caste system. In it, professions or occupations are strictly separated from each other. Men who were warriors had to remain warriors, and their sons had to be warriors too, because they belonged to the warrior class. Other castes were similarly closed, just like those of farmers and craftsmen. A farmer could never become a craftsman, or a craftsman a farmer, nor could their sons. Someone who was a member of one caste couldn't marry a girl from another, or even share a meal with someone from another caste. At the top were the priests, or the Brahmins, even higher than the warriors. Their task was to perform sacrifices to the gods and look after the temples, and, as in Egypt, they were in charge of sacred knowledge. They had to learn all the chants and prayers off by heart, so that when they were preserved and handed down unchanged. They did this for more than 1,000 years, until the texts were finally written down. A tiny part of the population was excluded from any caste. They were pariahs, people who were given the dirtiest and the most unpleasant tasks. Not even members of the lowest castes could associate with them. Their very touch was thought to be defiling, so they became known as the untouchables. They weren't allowed to fetch water from the streams that any of the other Indians used, and they had to make sure that their shadow never touched another person, because even that was thought to be defiling. People can be very cruel. But it would be wrong to say that the Indians were a cruel people. On the contrary, their priests were serious and profound thinkers, who often withdrew into the forest to meditate, alone and undisturbed, on the most difficult questions. They meditated on their many fierce gods and on the Brahma, the sublime, the highest divinity of all. They seemed to sense the breadth of this one supreme being throughout the natural world, in gods as well as men, and in every animal and plant. They felt him active in all things, in the shining of the sun and the sprouting of crops, in growing and in dying. He was everywhere, just as a little salt dropped in the water makes all the water salty, down to the last drop. In all the variety of nature and all her cycles and transformations, we only see the surface. A soul might inhabit the body of a man, and after his death, that of a tiger, or a cobra, or any other living creature. The cycle will only end when the soul has become so pure that it can at last become one with the supreme being. For the divine breath of the Brahma is the essence of all things. To help their pupils understand this, Indian priests had a lovely formula which you may turn over in your mind. All they said was, "This is you," by which they meant that everything around you, all the animals and the plants and your fellow human beings are, with you yourself, part of the breath of God. The priests had invented an extraordinary way of actually feeling this all-embracing unity. They would sit down somewhere in the depths of the ancient Indian forest and think about it, and nothing else, for hours, days, weeks, months, years. They sat on the ground, upright and still, their legs crossed and their eyes lowered. They breathed as little as possible, and they ate as little as possible. Indeed, some of them even tormented themselves in special ways to purify themselves and help them sense the divine breath within them. Holy men like these penitents and hermits were common in India 3,000 years ago, and there are still many of them today. But one of them was different from all the others. He was a nobleman named Gautama, and he lived about 500 years before Christ. The story goes that Gautama, whom they were later to call the Enlightened One, the Buddha, grew up in Eastern luxury and splendor. It is said that he had 3 palaces and that he never left, one for the summer, one for winter, and one for the rainy season, and that they were always filled with the most beautiful music. His father wouldn't allow him to leave their lofty terraces because he wanted to keep him far away from the sorrows of the world, and no one who was sick or unhappy was ever allowed near him. However, one day Gautama summoned his carriage and went out. On the way he caught sight of a man bent with age and asked his driver what it was. The driver was forced to explain that this was an old man. Deep in thought, Gautama returned back to his palace. On another occasion he saw someone who was sick. No one had ever told him about illness. Pondering even more deeply, he went home to his wife and a small son. A third time he went out and he saw a dead man. This time he didn't go home to his palace. Coming across a hermit in the road, he decided that he too would go into the wilderness, where he would meditate on the sufferings of this world, which had been revealed to him in the forms of old age, sickness, and death. Later in his life, Gautama told the story of his decision in a sermon. And so it came about that in the full freshness and enjoyment of my youth, in glowing health, my hair still black, and against the wishes of my weeping and imploring elders, I shaved my head and my beard, dressed in coarse robes, and forsook the shelter of my home. For 6 years he led the life of a hermit and a penitent, but his meditations were deeper and his sufferings greater than those of any other hermit. As he sat, he almost stopped breathing altogether and endured the most terrible pains. He ate so little that he often was faint with weakness. And yet in all those years he found no inner peace, for he didn't only reflect on the nature of the world and whether things were really one. He thought about its sadness and all of the pain and suffering of mankind, of old age, sickness, and death, and no amount of penitence could help him there. And so gradually he began to eat again. His strength returned, and he breathed like other people. Other hermits who had formerly admitted him now despised him, but he took no notice of them. Then one night he was sitting beneath a fig tree in a beautiful clearing in the wood, and understanding came. Suddenly he realized what he had been seeking all of these years. It was as if an inner light had made everything clear. Now, as the Enlightened One, the Buddha, he went out to proclaim his discovery to all men. It wasn't long before he found like-minded people who were soon convinced that he had found a way out of human suffering. And because these followers admired the Buddha, they formed what we could only call an order of monks and nuns. This order lived on after his death and still exists today in many Eastern countries. You can recognize its members by their yellow robes and their austere way of life. I imagine that you'd like to know exactly what happened to Gautama as he sat under the fig tree, the tree of enlightenment as it became known, that took away his doubts and brought him inner peace. But if you want me to try and explain it, you'll have to do some hard thinking too. After all, Gautama spent 6 whole years thinking about this and nothing else. The idea that came to him, his great enlightenment, the solution to human suffering, was this: if we want to avoid suffering, we must start with ourselves, because all suffering comes from our own desires. Think of it like this. If you are sad because you can't have something you want, maybe a book or a toy, you can do one of 2 things. You can do your best to get it, or you can stop wanting it. Either way, if you succeed, you won't be sad anymore. This is what the Buddha taught. If we can stop ourselves from wanting all the beautiful and pleasant things in life, and we can learn to control our greed for happiness, comfort, recognition, and affection, we shan't feel sad anymore when, as so often happens, we fail to get what we want. He who ceases to wish for anything ceases to feel sad. If the appetite goes, the pain goes with it. I can already hear you saying, that's all very well, but people can't help wanting things. The Buddha thought otherwise. He said that it is possible to control our desires, but to do so we need to work on ourselves, perhaps even for years, so that in the end we only have the desires that we want to have. In other words, we can become masters of ourselves in the same way that an elephant driver learns to control his elephant. A person's highest achievement on earth is to reach the point in which he or she no longer has any desires. This is the Buddha's inner calm, the blissful peace of someone who no longer has any wishes, someone who is kind to everyone and demands nothing. The Buddha has taught that the person who is the master of all of his wishes will no longer be reborn after his death. Only souls which cling to life are reborn, or so that is what the Buddha's followers believe. He who no longer clings to life is released from the unending cycle of birth and death, and at last is freed from all suffering. Buddhists call this state nirvana. So this was the enlightenment that the Buddha experienced under the fig tree, the realization that, instead of giving in to our wishes, we can break free from them, rather than when we are feeling thirsty and take no notice, and the feeling goes away. You can see the way to do this is far from easy. The Buddha called it the middle way, because it lay between the useless self-torment and the thoughtless pleasure-seeking. The important thing is to find the right balance in what we believe and what decisions we make, in what we say and what we do, in the way we live our life, in our ambitions, in our conscience and in our innermost thoughts. That was the essential message of the Buddha's sermons, and these sermons made such a deep impression on the people that many followed him and worshipped him as a god. Today there are almost as many Buddhists in the world as there are Christians, especially in Southeast Asia, in Sri Lanka, Tibet, China, and Japan. But not many of them are able to live their lives in accordance with the Buddha's teachings, and so achieve that inner calm. I'll do chapter 11, but Mecha Fanboy, I want to take a second and talk to you. So, one thing that I've realized, especially after reading the book, is that it's actually very difficult to do a sustained reading without tripping over a word or a turn of phrase. And as much as everybody likes to laugh about whether or not I pronounce nuclear in a wrong way, I'm getting really tired of hearing about it. Because I think people who take the time to talk about the way somebody pronounces the term, and by the way, I'm going to include that in George Bush. It's a way of completely ignoring the content of what somebody's saying and instead making fun of some very, very trivial and stupid stuff. So, I was originally going to time you out. I'm not going to. But please, for the love of God, let the joke drop. I'm getting really, really tired of hearing it. And to give you an idea of how tired I am of doing it, I'm taking this nice thing, which was supposed to be about everybody's enjoyment, to take the time to point out how sick I am of it. I hope that makes it clear. Chapter 11. The Great Teacher of a Great People. When I was a schoolboy, China was to us, as it were, at the other end of the world. At most, we had seen the odd picture on a teacup or a vase, so that we imagined a country of stiff little men with long plaits down their backs and artful gardens full of humpback bridges and little turrets hung with tinkling bells. Of course, there never was such a fairyland, although it's true that for more than 200 years, until 1912, Chinese men were made to wear their hair plaited in a pigtail. This was the first that we learned about them through delicate objects of porcelain and ivory made by skilled craftsmen. For their palace in the capital, the emperors had ruled over China for more than 1,000 years. The fabled emperors of China who called themselves the Son of Heaven, just as the Egyptian pharaoh had called himself the Son of the Sun. But at the time I'm going to talk about, around 2,500 years ago, all of this was yet to come, though China was already a vast and ancient kingdom. In its fields, many millions of hard-working peasants grew rice and other crops, while in the towns people strode through the streets in sumptuous silken gowns. Over all these people a king ruled, and beneath him many princes who governed the many provinces of this immense country, which was larger than Egypt and larger than Assyria and Babylon put together. But soon these princes had become so mighty that the king could no longer command their obedience. They were constantly at war with each other, the big provinces gobbling up the smaller ones. And because the empire was so vast in all its corners, the Chinese people spoke quite different languages. It would probably have fallen apart altogether if they had not one thing in common, and this was their script. But wait a minute, you say. If they all spoke different languages, how could they be using the script to make any difference? Well, the Chinese writing is special. You can read and understand it, even if you don't know a single word of the spoken language. That must be magic. No, absolutely not. It's actually really quite simple. Instead of writing words, you write things. If you want to write sun, you make a picture like this, a small box with a line through it. Then you can read it in any language, sun in English, soleil in French, or jin in Mandarin Chinese. Everyone who knows the sign will know what that means. Now I'll show you how to make the sign for tree. Again, it is quite easy, just a couple of strokes like this. Looks like a small tent. In Mandarin, it's pronounced mu, but you hardly need to know the sign to guess that it's a tree. All right, you say. I can see how that works well for things that you can draw. But what if you want to write white? Do you just paint a blob of white paint? And what if you want to write east? You can hardly draw a picture of east. On the contrary, you'll see that it's all quite straightforward. We can write white by drawing something that is white. In this case, a sunbeam. A stroke coming out of the sun stands for white, blanc, high. And east? Well, east is where the sun rises behind the trees, so I draw a picture of a sun behind the tree. That is clever, isn't it? Well, it is and it isn't. There are two sides to everything. For when you think about how many words and things there are in the world, in Chinese each one has its own sign which must be learnt. There are already more than 40,000 of them, and some are very complicated and hard to learn. So I think we all should congratulate our Phoenicians on their 26 letters, don't you? However, the Chinese have been writing like this for many thousands of years, and their signs are read in many parts of Asia, even where no Chinese is spoken. And this meant that the thoughts and principles of the great men of China were able to spread quickly and influence many people. Now, at the same time as the Buddha was seeking to relieve man's suffering in India, as you remember, that was around 500 BC, there was in China another great man who was also trying to make people happy through his teachings. And yet he was different from the Buddha as he could possibly be. He wasn't a wealthy nobleman's son, but came from a family that had fallen on hard times. He didn't become a hermit, but an advisor and a teacher. Rather than helping individuals not to want things, and therefore not to suffer, what mattered most to Confucius was that everybody should live peacefully together. Parents with their children, and rulers with their subjects. That was his goal, to teach the right way of living together. And he succeeded. Thanks to his teachings, all the peoples of China lived together for thousands years. Sorry guys, my computer just went to... Okay, so I'm gonna have to put a break on for a second. Everything's gone wrong. Hmm. I seem to be losing my music now. Sorry to put this on hold. I gotta figure out how to get everything working again. I may need to do a quick restart, but let me just see if I can fix something here. I know this is going to be terrible for the VOD, so my apologies to anybody who's listening on the recording. Okay, great. I think we are ready to go again. Sorry about the delay there. Thank you, Sir Wedgie. It's a vengeful spirit from Dota 2. Okay, I just want to check, is all the audio okay before I resume reading? I know there's probably going to be a little bit of a delay while I wait for the reply, so... Actually, I think I'm just going to go for it. It sounds crackly. Thank you, Sir Wedgie. Hopefully that fixes it, actually. Now, at the same time as the Buddha was seeking to relieve... I'm going to go but from the start of this paragraph. Now, at the same time as the Buddha was trying to relieve man's suffering in India, as you remember that was around 500 BC, there was in China another great man who was also trying to make people happy through his teachings. And yet he was different from the Buddha as he could possibly be. He wasn't a wealthy nobleman's son, but came from a family that had fallen on hard times. He didn't become a hermit, but an advisor and a teacher. Rather than helping individuals not to want things and therefore not to suffer, what mattered most to Confucius was that everybody should live peacefully together, parents with their children and rulers with their subjects. That was his goal, to teach the right way of living together, and he succeeded. Thanks to his teachings, all the peoples of China lived together for thousands of years, more contentedly and more peacefully than any other peoples in the world. So I am sure that you will be interested in the teachings of Confucius, or Kung Fu Zu as he was called to the Chinese. They aren't hard to understand, nor to remember. Perhaps that's why he was so successful. What Confucius proposed is quite simple. You may not like it, but there is more wisdom to it than first meets the eye. What he taught was this: outward appearances are more important than